going backwards in my lookbook.
So I'll go ahead and call this work session on the 2019 revised budgets to order.
Do we have the machine on recording?
Yes.
All right, let's go ahead and do a roll call. I guess I will start. Felix Rivera.
Thanks, Alaton.
John Weddleton.
Pete Peterson.
Dick Train.
Forrest Dunbar.
Gretchen Wemhoff.
Lance Wilbur, Office of Management and Budget.
Crystal Kennedy.
Mr. Constant. And then Mr. Dyson is somewhere.
Okay.
Great. That's important. All right. I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Mr. Wilbur.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate everyone taking time. Everyone should have a copy of the presentation. I tried to narrow it down, but I know that there will be some opportunities for questions here. So, purpose of this work session is to review with the Assembly the proposed adjustments to the approved 2019 operating budget for the municipality of Anchorage, as well as some adjustments to the utilities and enterprise, and I'm going to walk you through that. The documents for the proposed adjustments were introduced or laid on the table on Tuesday night, and you're scheduled to have a public hearing for action on the 23rd. So, for what I would like to share with the Assembly today is briefly just how we ended up 2018. The Assembly is going to be getting a more detailed quarterly report at probably the first meeting in May, when we have all of the year-end actuals done, but I'll give you a little sneak preview of that today. The 2019 approved. I added a few slides to this presentation for the benefit of some of the new Assembly members that weren't part of the approved budget process, to kind of remind you of what some of the priorities were and some of the adjustments we made back then, just to give you a little bit of a perspective and a reminder. But most of the presentation will be on the 2019 adjustments. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the assumptions and the direction that we took in this approach for the adjusted budget. Also, a little bit of historical perspective. I think in the past the Assembly has been interested in the changes that we've made each quarter, so I have some information for you there. Some of the revenue adjustments and the direct costs. Each of these were identified inside your Assembly documents, but I'll walk through each of them as well, and if you have questions, I'll do my best to address those. A summary of what the budget changes were, how the mill levies will turn out, and then based on some comments heard from the Assembly's Budget and Finance Committee, I put together a what-if scenario in the event that the Assembly wanted to entertain adjusting the mill levy specifically for the school district for bond debt reimbursement. I gave you some scenarios on your slides here. We'll talk about those. And then a page about the utilities and enterprises, and then sort of our path forward. So that's what we've got in store for you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. Just want to put in the record that we've been joined by Ms. LaFrance.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right. So 2018. Right now, our budget to actuals show that in 2018, the expenditures, we turned out very well. We're at 97% spent, so 3% underspent for 2018. Some highlights in there, and you'll get more detail later, but street maintenance left probably about $2 million on the table. We gave them a lot of extra money for snow removal. Didn't snow very much in 2018. And some of the work that Susie Marshall's been doing in IT to negotiate contracts, we've seen some savings in there. And then there's there's savings pretty much in every single department. The exception would be in finance, because of the extensive work they did in 2018 on payroll corrections. So payroll really took you'll see probably some adjustments there. So overall, for all departments and direct cost expense, the municipality did very well. So we came in at about 97%. The revenues, that $1.7 million, that's in total of all the revenues that we received, not only for general government, but for all taxes, but for other resources. And the treasurer provided you some information at your April meeting. Suffice it to say that out of $715 million in revenues, we were 1.7 off, and it's pluses and minuses across the board. Room tax was up, for example. However, the amount that we had for the revenue sharing was down, and so, but the net at the end of the day was a negative 1.7 million in our revenues for 18, and there's a lot of detail in Dan's report that he provided you at your meeting earlier this week. I will say that thanks to Alex Slifka, the CFO, one of the things that we are able to share with you now that we weren't able to share with you last year is they were able to get a fund balance number for us that we were able to build into this budget. Our fund balance right now is a positive 600,000. We've included that as part of this budget. That 600,000 for some of the new assembly members. We have a fund balance policy where we keep at least 10 and then 2%, so a total of 12, to make sure that we have some emergency reserves for capital expenses, plus maintain our bond rate. We have secured all of those. Once we've met all of those obligations, we have about a $600,000 fund balance. It's called unrestricted or unreserved, and we have that information available to include it in this budget. And then for the enterprise and utilities, again, you'll have more detail, but right now it appears that ML&P and AWU did very well for their budgets at year end. Solid waste is going to be very close, as well as the port and Merrill Field from their approved budgets, but we'll get you some more details there. So overall, 2018, based on how we ended, based on what we budgeted, the departments did a very good job.
I have some questions for you, Mr. Wilbur.
Sure.
Mr. Constant.
Thank you. I apologize if I missed this at the briefing earlier last week or this week, but when you say you've calculated out the expenses for 2018, does that account for the extraordinary expenses of the earthquake?
Oh, excellent question. So it does. And so what we've done is, as you recall, the Assembly and the administration, with Assembly support, we created a separate fund for earthquake. All of those earthquake expenses are in a separate account. It's not credited towards the cost of their direct approved budget. So the earthquake expenses are separate.
So they're separate, but in accounting sense, are we also equal revenue to expenses? We have those costs covered at this time.
So at this time we do, because we put in $19 million into the general government. We created a fund with $19 million. We've only expended about 3 of it to date, and the utilities have spent probably, I think, 5 of their 11. And then, because we're in the process right now of determining of the expenses that we have incurred for the earthquake in this separate account, how much of those will we not recover at all. We do believe right now that all of the expenses that we have done, where our development services department has gone out and done home inspections and building inspections and all of those will not be recoverable from FEMA. Those are expenses we are going to have to consume inside our accounts. So we won't be able to recover that from FEMA. Whether or not we adjust our tax cap now or whether or not we adjust it as part of next year, because we have the ability to do that, we're still trying to get some details from FEMA as to our timing on that. There are other expenses that some of them will be recoverable and some of them will not. And until we have that determined outside just the inspections, we'll make a determination what we are going to recover from FEMA and what we're not going to recover from FEMA. So a lot of more work to be done. But that number does not reflect earthquake expenses.
And just for the record, I want to note that we've been joined by Mr. Carlton, Ms. Quinn Davidson, Mr. Weddleton.
Well, I'm glad to see revenues are minus 1.7, but I had noticed in February we were told -3, and then I didn't have a date, but somewhere more recently was going to be
Right.
6.5 million short. So
This number right here is the report that I've got from Treasury as a result of the 2018 year end. There may have been some accounts that were in a negative position, but other accounts had gone positive. So this is the number that Dan had provided to me and to you at a negative 1.7 in total.
And that's pretty stable then? Because
That's
obviously
done.
it bounced around.
That's done for 2018.
Okay.
That's done.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Also, for the record, we've been joined by Assembly Member-elect Perez Verdilla. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I must have missed the meeting. How did the marijuana taxes come in last year? Did we meet projections? Are we under?
I could find out exactly on that one. I think we were over by 500, and then we made the adjustment. I think we budgeted 3.5 and came in at 4. I'll have to get with Treasury. I can
Okay.
find out.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you guys have a lot of questions on 18. We haven't even got to the fun yet. All right. So I'm going to move along. So this slide here, as I was mentioning earlier, I just want to remind the Assembly and some of the new Assembly members how we built 19 and some of the priorities that we had. As you recall, the administration continues to put public safety as a priority, and so when we built that budget and we are looking at this budget, we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're doing to maintain that public safety, particularly as it relates to police and fire. On the economic development side, the efforts that we're doing in development services and working with Chris Schuette's shop to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to enhance and promote economic development. Housing and homelessness, again, a priority for this administration. And then fund balance. The reason that fund balance we have it here as a priority for 19 is we wanted to make sure that we had a fund balance when we got here. We knew that was an intention for the Assembly, so it was important there. Just to remind you, when we built the budget, we did have some increases, we had some known increases in our health care and our labor. These costs, when we built 19, we made them based on projections for our health care and projections for our labor based on existing on those, and then for actuals for labor, the police and fire retirement system. This is a contribution to a certificate of participation. In 17 we contributed. In 18 we adjusted how we were going to do the contribution, so we didn't have any contribution. In 19 we showed that we had to start those contributions again, and so that's where that 7.5 comes in. So the total amount of the 19 budget for those reasons had gone up. The things that we had the things that we built in 2019, and I won't go through each one of these, but you can see, public safety, police and fire retirement we talked about, and a variety of other things that we contributed to as part of our approved budget. So we added some things there. We also put in a lot of reductions. So departments, we had about almost $6 million worth of reductions in a variety of those things. And as a reminder to the Assembly, in this budget, we did not add anything to SAP, whether it's operating or capital. We had been operating on the capital side, the money had already appropriated, and Susie Marshall in IT has been moving forward successfully, though a little bit slower than I think she had anticipated, in reprogramming and redeveloping, reorganizing her department to create that in-house capability and support. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So that's where 19 started. So now
Mr. Wilbur, actually, I have a question from Mr. Train.
Oh, thank you.
Lance, the $500,000 for housing and homelessness,
Right.
where's that going?
I think part of it was for the mobile intervention team, part of it was for camp cleanup, and then there was part of it for, I think, match to grant program. I don't remember specifically where each one of them was.
Be back on camp cleanup again?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
April 22nd.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about sort of the overview and the process for 2019. So for the state budget, the administration, obviously, we do not know where they're ultimately going to end in a variety of things, both on their operating, their capital, their matching programs. We have a lot of resources inside our budget based on state grants that support a variety of services. The other thing that so until that is settled, we don't have any significant changes. If there are significant changes, the places they will impact probably directly, immediately, will be the health department, and probably maybe some at APD, depending on how some of those state grants come in for DUI enforcement and a variety of other things. So, municipal assistance. So, what we have done in this one is our budget, our approved budget, was based on the anticipated receipt of municipal assistance or revenue sharing. The amount that we have in our approved budget is 6.1. That is the dollar amount that we received in 2018. We did not make any assumptions that number would be more or be less. So in this budget, we're assuming 6.1 revenue sharing would continue into this budget. The things that we do in the first quarter budget revision is after we approve this, we approve 19, we make a variety of adjustments based on the projections that we made in November. Once the 18 closes, we revise and true up the expenses that we have based on actuals. We also make sure that we have enough reserves for our 10 and our 2% that I showed earlier. We true up our revenues. After 18 closes, Treasury makes a brand new projection on how the revenues are going to look out into the future. They true those things up based on actuals. The result of that effort for 19, when you net out those changes, it shows a reduction of about almost $4 million. I'll talk a little bit more in detail. There are really some big pieces in that, and I'll talk about those, but one specifically is we had originally anticipated receipt of federal revenues as a result of the action of the state that would support ambulance fees to the tune of about $3.6 million. We're not anticipating getting those revenues in 19, but we do eventually anticipate getting the revenues. They just won't have them in 19 as we expected. So direct costs, when we look at all of the things that we're going to talk about that we're adding in and some reductions in other things, the direct cost of this budget is going to go up about $2 million. And then the tax need and the mill rates is going to go up about 5.7. I will talk about those a little bit more detail as I move along.
I have a couple questions, Mr. Wilbur. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've been working under the assumption for a couple of years, actually, that municipal assistant number is going to go to 0. And I thought we had that conversation last year that we weren't going to build it in, or we were going to see it reduced. Yesterday, or perhaps it was the day before yesterday, the State House passed an operating budget. Did it include municipal assistance? This might be a question for you, Ona.
Through the chair, the operating budget doesn't include municipal assistance, but that's not where it comes from.
Okay.
So the revenue sharing has remained in the budget because of our conversations through our lobbyists and directly with legislative leaders and Anchorage legislators who are saying that their intent is to continue the municipal assistance program as it has been for the last 2 years. There was a decrease 1 year to the next, and then they put a supplemental on top of it, so there was more. But this is the amount that they are saying that they intend to put in the kitty for Anchorage. So as of right now, we're going with what we know and what we have been told by the people who hold these purse strings. And if for some reason the case changes, then we will deal with that just like all the rest of these things as we get actual facts into our budget process.
Sure. So I get that misunderstanding on my part. I thought that municipal assistance was part of the operating budget. Where does it come from if not there?
It depends. They move it around. So sometimes it's in operating, sometimes it's in capital. They put supplementals in different places.
So it only comes from supplementals is
No,
where it comes from?
not only from supplementals.
Okay. I remain worried, but I don't fault you for putting it in there if that's what you're hearing. But I do think that if I was a legislator looking for places to cut and looking for horses to trade, taking away that money from Anchorage is something I could see the rest of the state wanting to do. And of course they would suffer, some of them would suffer too, but I could see this being a particularly rich target. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. And for the record, that was Ono Brow's Chief of Staff. Mr. Trainee, then Mr. Dyson.
Oh, no, state was also talking about taking away $2.1 million that we normally get on the oil company assets here. Has that been factored into this too?
So the oil and gas property tax is under the cap. So if the state takes that away through legislation, then other property taxpayers in Anchorage just have to pick up the rest.
Suck up the rest.
Yes. Revenue sharing is outside the cap.
Thank you, Ona.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, excuse me, I may have missed something, but did you talk to anybody in the Senate about this municipal revenue sharing being in the budget?
Through the chair, Mr. Dyson, I did not directly speak with
Did
anyone
Wendy?
in the Senate, but our lobbyists have.
They've talked to somebody in the Senate.
Yes.
and think it's gonna be in there.
Yes.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Go ahead, Mr. Wood.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure, Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lance, do you have an idea of what the municipal assistance is for different jurisdictions? Like, how is that determined? Or Ms. Browse?
Through the chair to Ms. Davidson. There is a formula in state statute that develops how it is distributed. There is a floor for all of the smaller non-incorporated cities, boroughs, areas, and we have not the actual population proportional representative dollar amount because the other smaller areas have the floor to guide them as their minimum. So I can get you the formula if you want to see what that breakout is.
That's okay. I'm just sort of wondering what the political will be, but that's actually good for us if other communities will also be arguing for this.
And the other communities are usually affected much more drastically
Right.
because it is larger portions of their budget.
pocket. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. No further questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so I mentioned earlier, I wanted to just share with you a little bit of historical. What this slide shows you is the changes that have been brought before the Assembly by the previous administration and mostly this administration based on what was in an approved budget and the adjustments that were made as part of the 1Q. These adjustments, they can be made for a variety of reasons, but in the totality of the adjustments, I share this with you because the Assembly has been interested in the past. Again, as I mentioned on the first slide, this adjustment here is a result of balancing, getting into a balanced budget. It's an increase of about $2 million. I can tell you that back in 2017, a lot of that increase is, and many of these are a result of settlements. We're allowed to adjust our tax cap for settlements. I believe the bulk of the reasons why we did adjustments in 17 was for a CLIPA settlement, and then and so anyway, it could be for a variety of reasons. If there are Assembly members who are interested in the detail, I can share that with you. As it relates to 2019, the things that we took into account for this adjustment, I mentioned them. Fund balance, I'm going to talk a little bit about the revenue adjustments, the expenditures, and then the service areas.
Mr. Trainee.
Lance, we had about a $2 million loss for the police department on that one case. Have we decided if we're going to appeal that yet, or just pay what we owe?
So
for that individual one?
Right.
We can deal with that?
Right, so, to the chair. Recently, the court had made a decision that there was a potential settlement cost to the municipality, to an individual. We're not done with that process yet, and until the law department is completely done with whether or not they want to make, what's the right word I'm looking for? What's the right word I'm looking for, Dee?
An analysis.
Yeah, just looking into see if that's, if we're agreeable to the settlement. Until that's done, then I will be told what the number is for sure, and then we will adjust the tax cap, but it won't be in this tax cap.
Will the administration come to the Assembly to see if we want to appeal that decision, we want to settle it and get it done?
I think they're working on that process right now.
Okay, I just want to make sure it's not just administration, but in conjunction with the Assembly, because I've seen these go up over the years. At some point in time, it's better to cut your losses. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so the next couple slides is really the meat of the changes, and each one of these lines, when you look at your Assembly documents, this one will be in your Assembly resolution as it relates to the operating budget. I'm going to walk through each one of these. So this slide here shows, as I mentioned, one of the things that we do, we true up our revenue forecast, and this slide summarizes where the pluses and the minuses are, and then the result of those revenue adjustments. So first one, our overall investment earnings of all, not in any one particular account, our investment earnings, we did pretty well. We revised our projections, so about another $500,000 in revenues from our interest earnings. The tax anticipation notes, while we expect some earnings from that money actually is going to turn right around and go directly to an expense for tax anticipation notes. While we've earned some, there's a cost to that as well. So when you look on the expense side, so that does not affect our taxes at all. Transit fares. What we've done in transit fares is, as a result of 2018, the transit fares that they had budgeted and what they actually received was higher than they budgeted in 18. When we built 19, we did not include those additional revenues. And the reason we didn't, because we were on a path that they would actually be moving out of the transit center to a location significantly different than that one. They may be moving across the street. Anticipating that move, we also know that when they do those things, they get a reduction in their revenues. So we didn't add it then. Now knowing that they're not going to be moving from that directly from that location, we've included those revenues because we do believe that they'll be realized. However, on the expense sheet, the next one, we're going to allow them to spend all of that money on motor fuel, on diesel. And so they're going to get an increase in their budget by $375,000 for the expense of fuel, but it's going to be covered for transit fares. So the next one, the state of Alaska traffic court fines. We've been talking to Treasury. We received garnishments through PFD and other matters, but primarily through PFD for traffic court fines. Really what happened here is they think they're going to get an increase in that one, but when you look down below, there's going to be a reduction in the trial court fines. So it's basically a net zero, but to true up where the expenses are where the revenues are coming in, we're making that adjustment. There's no big change. Reimbursements for cost for P cards. Similar to when you use your credit card, you get mileage or points or whatever you may get depending on your card. In our P card system, the more credit card purchases we have, we get basically a savings. And so we expect an additional savings or revenues, from them, about $150,000. We get that based on the amount of activity we have in P cards. In the motor fuel tax, basically the motor fuel tax, that's going up. Motor fuel, the tax is going up there, and that's primarily related to basically I think the gas tax, so that's up a little bit. Penalty, delinquent taxes on penalties and interest, so that the amount of revenue will be up there. The room tax, room tax is up. Room is up about 4.3%. So the revenue for there is about $500,000. However, when that money goes up, we don't get to keep all that money. We have to have some contractual obligations. We give some of that to the Denina Center and to ACDB. And then we have a variety of other building permit reviews, tobacco tax, and code enforcement. We expect a little bit up there. So those are some of the key revenue increases that we're seeing that we basically are truing up for 19 1Q.
So, Mr. Wilbur, before we get to revenue decreases, I have a whole host of questions here. Mr. Dunbar.
Mine relates to the ambulance fees, so I'll wait till after you explain that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Constant.
Thank you. On the transit fare increase, do you know what that's attributable to?
So they had an increase in ridership from last year. So what they had in 18, it's basically an increase in ridership.
So is this something that we can attribute to the new structure of the routes and the organization of our system, or is there some other variable we should consider?
I would say the former, and I'll confirm that with Jamie. But yeah, it takes a while for that stuff to settle down, and then it's starting to pick back up. And so the overall usage of transit, whether it's the fixed route or the neighborhood routes or the paratransit service, it's a combination of all of those.
It would be great to understand the change in ridership.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Sure. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually spoke with Jamie a couple of weeks ago. She was saying the fact that we have given bus passes to students, they've gotten used to riding the buses, and so that it's created to more fares being purchased as well. Once you figure out the bus routes, then people are more likely to use the bus service.
access equals usage. Ms. Wimhoff.
Actually, the school district contributes to the student bus pass system, so that needs to be considered in there as well. You had mentioned that the transit fares, originally there was a concept of they might need the money to relocate, et cetera, and of course they didn't. Were you discussing the potential temporary move that which still may occur, but we know that ACDA is going to pay for that. Transit is not on the hook for paying for that.
Right. The cost of the move is I believe is true. It's on ACDA's responsibility. However, the impact on the revenues to the move were anticipated to hurt their revenues, and so rather than anticipating they would receive them in 19 originally, we didn't budget it. But now that those things have changed, we've done it, and they actually put in a request for fuel, and so we were able to, based on the logic of their service and the status next door and their request for fuel, we're able to do this.
Thank you. And I can partially address Mr. Constant's question. I was on the PTAB and I continue to attend the meetings through my time on the assembly. And the concept is that they do attribute it to the new planning, and they just right now are working on, every year they do some adjustments, and they're adjusting some things because of that plan as well. For instance, they're stopping things at midnight, so the airport run won't go to 2, but then they're picking up more on routes that seem to be more active and increasing their frequency. But from what they see, it is definitely for the first time in over a decade, we're starting to see an increase, and they do believe it's due to the new route services.
Ms. Breps.
Through the chair to Mr. Constant and to address Ms. Wimhoff's comments, Sunday ridership is up 17%, I believe, since the reorganization. So that in and of itself lets you know that people are using the new system because it works for them.
Yeah, there was no Sunday ridership at all, and so to have it, period. Yeah.
Hour
Thank you.
brunch.
Thank you, Ms. Wimhoff. Mr. Croft.
A lot of it got answered. I thought you said that the transit was balanced by a deficit on the
When I get to the direct cost pages as you're reading ahead,
okay,
that's
so
so
it's not-
unlike you to read ahead.
I'm
surprised. You'll have a transit fuel expense of $375.
I got you. Okay, I didn't see it on the other. And then the small and open up, you're getting to the decreases. Are marijuana taxes down? Or sales down? It's listed under miscellaneous or decreases.
I don't think so. I'll have to confirm it, but I don't think the total is down.
And the big one on your decreases is ambulance fees, and that's because of the state changing.
I'm going to get to that one. That's exactly right. I'm going to get to that next. The decrease.
So you were just on the increases. Then, okay, and the court fines increase is independent of. I know what we think the dividend will be affects that a lot, but that's not that. It's just
that is
collection.
that. So we've made that adjustment. Yeah. So our that's exactly what that is. What we've done between the traffic court fines and the trial court fines is make an adjustment onto where they're
anticipating a higher dividend.
Yes. No, we budgeted. We're just moving the money around between court and trial. We built this budget on a PF. We built the original budget with a PFD of $2,500. We're still assuming that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Croft. Go ahead, Mr. Wood.
Thank you. So the next one is ambulance fees. The ambulance fees is made up of two things, but one thing primarily. I've mentioned this before, and that is we had originally budgeted a receipt of Medicaid funds through a reimbursement process from the feds. In order for us to receive those federal funds, we have to go through a process that requires some data compilation, which we're working with the fire chief and multiple fire chiefs across the state. It also requires that the state of Alaska provide a notice of when to let the public know that we anticipate to receive those Medicaid funds for the recovery cost of Medicaid patients for ambulances. So The path we originally were on back in October and November is that notice would have been out soon enough so that we would have received the funds in 19. The notice is still not out. The notice has to be done by the state of Alaska. They have not done that yet. It's not related to the state budget. It's just it's an action to put notice out. Now the state is looking for some information before they do that. We're compiling that for them. That's, I think, some new information, but we're on the path to do it. But in order to create a balanced budget, we're not going to get the money in 19, so we took it out. As a reminder, if they put the notice out in July, any expenses from July through December, we will actually be able to recover those. We just won't get the money until 20. Once the notice is set, those transports from that date forward, we can recover for it. We just won't have the cash in the bank this year. And we won't have it early enough in 20 to account it as a revenue in 19. So we took it out.
So, Felix, can I ask my questions now?
Sure, Mr. Dunbar. Then I have 3 questions on that topic.
Thank you. That's not the answer I was expecting, an explanation I was expecting, and so I'm glad to have that new information. I guess I have a couple of questions, and the first is, I know on your initial presentation for us about the state budget, you projected something like $9 million reduction or something.
Right.
There was a very large fall in ambulance fees, or revenue related to ambulance fees. I think it was tied to Medicaid. I could be mistaken about that. But you're saying this is distinct from that. This is something else.
So let me...
Ona has her hand up.
Please continue.
Okay. The total amount of, when we started this budget 1Q process, we were looking at a deficit of about, based on what we knew at that time, was about a $10 million reduction. And we shared with you some of the immediate anticipated potential, or the potential impacts of the state budget, and we came up with a $9 million number.
Okay.
Part of that $9 million was 3.6 from this ambulance as it relates to actions on behalf of the state or lack thereof. So
Okay, so it was built into that $9 million number.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
but unlike the other cuts where Governor Levy has justified them for ostensibly deficit reasons or fiscal responsible reasons, this is not that. You're saying that this is money that the federal government would pay to us, but for the state government, is it fair to say they've dragged their feet? Or are you saying that it's something we didn't do and has caused them to delay?
I think it's a combination of mostly them not acting fast enough.
Okay.
We had a plan based on the information we had to get the calendar started in October. We were working with the previous administration to do that. That didn't happen, and the new administration has taken on. They're catching up and learning. We want some information. We still anticipate the money coming in. We're just not going to get it this year.
Okay, have one more follow-up. Then for Ona, for you, or perhaps from the mayor as well, it's all well and good to say, oh, we'll get that money in 2020, but there's a time value of money, and $4 million today is worth a lot more to us than $4 million in 2 years. Is this worth going and talking to the media about? Talking to because I don't think people in Anchorage know this, that the state of Alaska has perhaps cost us $4 million. That seems worth at least one story.
Through the chair to Dunbar. So let me clarify that this additional revenue is the result of legislation that was passed by the legislature last year. One of the
Okay,
rural
so it's still-
legislators knows that there's enough room in the Medicaid reimbursement and change state statute to be able to recoup more of our Medicaid reimbursements than we currently are. So the process that Lance explained that requires the Alaska Association of Fire Chiefs and the state HES department to put out these Medicaid notices is part of a process. I think given that it is a combination of needing data that the fire chiefs are working on, coupled with getting the notice out from the State Department, that we are not quite in a place where pointing fingers is necessarily the best course of action. So we're keeping our eye on this to push it because it is so much revenue, but we are working through with the fire chiefs and the other entities required to do this so that we can get to a place where the revenue is actually going to come to our budget. But if and when the time comes, we will let you know.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dicey.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to clutter up this discussion with my specific questions. My guess on ambulance fees, very few people that we pick up to take actually pay for it. Is that correct?
We don't recover for the full cost, and how many of them actually pay, I don't know.
Yeah, so offline, I'd like to have just back of the envelope on that. And mostly when you use the fees, I suspect you're saying it's not what the client pays, but it's what we get reimbursed for from Medicare, Medicaid, and so on and so forth. So I'd like that to be clear. And I'd encourage you to put fees reimbursement or something on that one. And when offline also, tobacco tax, if we know, I'd like to know the difference, how much of the tobacco tax we get is from non-cigarettes, other kinds of tobacco. Not for today, but thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Constant.
Thank you. So again, last question, hopefully on the ambulance fees for me. This is increased revenue.
Right.
Above because of this rebalancing of the Medicaid reimbursement. So these numbers don't really capture or show us what our actuals are relative to the unincreased number, right? So our current number of how much we gain from ambulance fees, do we know where we are at that? Are we on par?
I think our actual, the amount of transports and the recipient of the transports is down as well. It's a pretty small piece. It's like 300,000, but we have the detail for each one of those, and we can share those with you. It's not in the budget document because we kind of net it. Yeah, we're really close.
Okay, thank you.
Except for that federal program.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Go ahead.
Thank you. So the next one, utility revenues. So when we built this budget, we build a budget whether or not we're actually going to see utility revenues, primarily in the form of a utility dividend. When we go back and we work through the utilities, we are anticipating a reduction actually in the amount of dividend primarily from solid waste services. We had originally expected to get some revenue both in solid waste services is two utilities, the revenues and refuse and collections. But when they closed out 18 and they're looking at their net position and to make sure that they have enough money for capital reserves and operating reserves, they were not able to meet the projection that we had for them. They are going to pay a small dividend, but it's not going to be as much as we anticipated. The administration is working on, I think the Assembly will soon receive some information on this one as a result of how SWS will be paying their dividends in the future. So we anticipate that, but we took that out based on where they ended 18 and where they're looking to be in 2019. So that's primarily for SWS.
Are you talking about MISA or?
No, I'm talking about utility revenue.
So we get both the dividend and the tax?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dunbar.
Can you say a little bit more about why SWS? I know that they received substantial earthquake damage. Was that related to it? Or
I don't believe it was related to their earthquake damage. So I think primarily where they thought they were actually going to be in their net position at the end of the year is not as strong as they thought. So
I guess I'll do the chair. There's one thing which is why you're going to see it revised to the ordinance, is we set aside $33 million for the landfill closure fund. The way it currently reads, that gets marked to market. At the end of the year, there was a $2 million deficit change, and so that's what took the disposal from a positive number to a negative number. And so what we're going to do on a go-forward basis, we're going to ask you to consider looking at their operations, positive or negative, as a factor for determining dividend, rather than having to deal with fluctuations in the market. Just as a reference point, that fund has completely recovered in the first quarter all of that $2 million difference.
Thank you, Mr. Slade. Go ahead, Mr. Slade.
Thank you. So moving along to tobacco tax. So we got a revised estimate from Treasury, and basically this is, they go back and they look back 4 years, so this is a trend. So $800,000. That one and the MUSA and the MISA calculations, it's a variety of challenges there. For this assembly and new assembly members, that tobacco tax is under the cap, and the MUSA and MISA is also under the cap. So when those numbers go down, the tax cap adjusts through the property taxes to maintain the tax cap. So those things there do affect the tax cap. We talked about trial court fines. Build America bonds, basically that's an anticipated subsidy from the federal government from bonds from the past through other federal programs, and the amount that we thought we would receive is about $80,000 less. And we have a scattering of a couple of things that each one of these is lined item for net about $67,000 less. So in total, our total revenue adjustments are down about $4 million.
I have one question from Mr. Train.
Hey, Lance, I understand the 800,000 reduction, but let's look at the positive side. How much we actually get on tobacco tax? About 22
million.
How much?
22 million.
Thank you.
Mr. Peters.
I rest my case.
And so is that, you think that tax is down because people are driving to the valley to buy cigarettes?
I'm thinking not. Mr. Peters.
Are they buying their gas here, or where are they buying their gas? We got the fuel
They
tax.
drive out there, fill up the gas, and then
Buy cigarettes and come here?
No.
I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, they don't have to need to buy alcohol.
No problem, Mr. Peters.
All right. Since you're having so much fun, let's talk about what we're going to add to this budget. So I talked about this is basically a no net. We do have some revenue increases, and so that we're going to pay that tax anticipation note. That's basically a net zero, but we have to show that change when we're truing up the budget over time. So when we were through the changes and the truing up of all of the budgets that we did, we scrubbed all the personnel, we scrubbed the cost of medical, the agreements, the collective bargaining units, and as a result of that, in that analysis, one of the things that we are proposing here is that for public safety and overtime, there will be an increase to the police department for about $750,000, but there's going to be a reduction to the fire department, and that is a result of the changes they made in the agreement to move firefighters to ambulances, which is actually reducing their overtime and being basically a good change from the fire department. So the net that you'll see in public safety for overtime is up, but most of it's in APD, and that's lined out in the budget. Stormwater utility, we're proposing that we put $450,000 to progress the development of that stormwater utility. As that moves forward, as the result of that, creating the documentation, the backup, the identification of service areas and rates and all of the things that are required to create a utility, through that process, there's a strong likelihood that some of those expenses could be capitalized. So if the utility is successful and it gets in place in later this year or early next year, some of those expenses could actually be recovered through those utilities. So that's what that 450 is for. We talked about transit fuel. We do have an obligation based on an adjustment to contractuals for the PAC and the museum. We make an adjustment based on CPI. Our cost to both of those facilities is an increase of $337,000. Fire Department Academy, we talked about this when we built 19. The fire department had money in their 18 budget. They were in the process of funding Academy. They were not going to expend all that money. We waited until 18 closed. Whatever that balance was, we added it to 19. And that's what this action is. So this is basically giving the fire department the money they needed to accomplish the Academy they had already underway. We talked about room tax contributions. In the revenues, remember we were getting about $500,000. Some of that money we actually have to spend on this, and so that's room tax contractual costs, ACBB, Denina, so that's expense there. Litigation, we know that we have some anticipated litigation costs above what's already budgeted, so we're anticipating those. Voter-approved bond debt, we're new assembly members, every time, at this time of the year, after the bonds are approved or not, we adjust the O&M cost, that adjusts the taxes. That's an increase in their homelessness initiatives. So this is a two-parter. We have a position in, so homeless coordinator is grant funded for part of the year, and anticipated that grant funding, at least at this point, will not be there. We also added about $25,000 into John Rada's budget for additional camp cleanup. And so that's what that's about. Some labor alignment. We had a position, primarily it was in the mayor's office. They were absorbing that position. And so making a recommendation that they have the budget to fund that position rather than the budget that they had. So development services code abatement. They had about $70,000. They had about $70,000 from last year that they did not spend. We want to give that to them this year. Development services is going to trade basically in a position from a land use enforcement, code abatement. We're going to give them an extra $100,000 to make that happen. We have some one-time expenses we're asking for. One of them is to complete an affirmative action plan for the municipality. The other one is for the library. It's focused at the Chugiak Eagle River Library. They have, I believe it's a book handling system. We want to put some money in their operating budget. We're going to contribute it to capital to finish that capital expense. Auction costs, through Ron Haddon, the auction costs that we have. The anticipated activity through our auction year and through that auction process, that activity is expected to go up. So we'll make more money, but will actually cost more money. So that's basically a net zero for them. We have a settlement for a legal action that was taking place in Girdwood through the Forest Fair process. So that's an area-wide cost because the actions that were taken there resulted in an area-wide settlement. Audit, this is in the Assembly office. They anticipated some additional costs for their audit contracts, so we're proposing to add that in there. And then service area adjustments. We adjust the service areas based on the recommendations and approvals of all of the 40-some service areas. So CD Ursa, Chugiak, the Parks Board, Girdwood, limited road service areas up on the hillside. When their boards make adjustments, we just true that up based on their approvals. And so that's a net increase of about $500,000.
Excuse me.
In their total.
If I may, when you get a chance, just break that out for us.
Yep. In your AM support, we broke it out by every single service area. Every for all of them are laid down. So.
All right, so I have a couple questions here. Mr. Constant.
Two, please. Stormwater utility, can we at some point in the near future get a briefing on the status of that?
Absolutely.
And then, so that settlement line, is that one case only?
It is.
That's really disheartening. That's crucial. That's really disheartening that he was able to get that much. So that's just their takeaway. So maybe we can, at some point in the not too distant future, also get a briefing on the status of current litigation.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Weddleton.
So on the APD, most of that overtime is APD. So we kind of look at that. Well, we got lots more cops. Why more overtime? Then some of it, we get grants for DUI and stuff like that. That's always going to be overtime. There's some built in there. How much is just because we had a lot of crime and they had to go deal with it?
So one of the things I'll remind the Assembly is that when we built 19, while in the first slide, while we did give police and public safety a lot more money in 19, that wasn't all ads. One of the things that we did, we reduced their overtime by $1.5 million. So this would add in $750, so it would recover about half of that overtime.
Well, the earlier 19 budget had $1.5 million.
Reduction in their overtime. Yes.
So what'd you base on the, you need?
So what we did.
Thought, how come?
So what we did is, when we trued up the labor adjustments, when we looked at their contracts, their agreements for their CBAs and their actuals, the amount of money that we had budgeted for them for those things, we just reallocated it to their overtime.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Dunbar.
I'm fine, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Trainee.
Last on the auction contract, do they look you put that back out for rebid Or are we just gonna try and negotiate with people who already have the contract?
I got the, from purchasing, whether it's the new contract or the existing contract, whatever the status of the contract activity in 2019, whether it's the past vendor or a new vendor, purchasing anticipates that their activity will be more in 19. And so that is why we added the expense to the purchase. Basically, it's to purchasing to increase their budget by $50,000, but the revenue from that is coming from the auction. But we have to give them the ability to spend it on that.
And there's just been a problem in years past with the companies that get the option. They always anticipate increased costs.
This is, I think, primarily, as I understand it from Ron Haddon, it's not a cost of the contract as it relates to the activity they're going to undertake.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. I have Mr. Peterson, Constant, and then Dyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And down here under the audit contract made me think about the SAP audit that we've been speaking about for several years. Is that in the works?
So I don't believe this is related to that. I think this is primarily related to the BDO contract for the municipality, which is in the clerk's office.
Okay.
And so that was an anticipated adjustment there.
But we're not totally forgetting about that SAP audit, are we? That's eventually.
Through the chair, you may be thinking about, we did a complete impairment study of what was the total cost of our SAP system. Was any of it impaired? And that was done last year and completed. Off the top of my head, I want to say the number was something $700,000 that we're going to write off against 2018 as stuff that we spent money on that we didn't implement. And there's two things: it's a time clock and a budgeting system that we didn't use. All the rest of it capitalized is being expensed. So I think we can give you an update on SAP, but it's done, it's installed, it's working very well.
Well, I thought that one of the reasons we were talking about doing an audit is possible lawsuit against SAP.
Those conversations are ongoing, and I guess, yes, we could get some additional information for you. I mean, we are routinely telling them we're not paying these very large bills that they keep asking us for, and those very large bills keep getting smaller. We will provide some information on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. It is 2 p.m., which is how late this work session was scheduled for. If there's no objection, we'll keep going.
I'll be done in, I got like 6 more. I'll move through the next 2.
I still do have 3 questions, so if we can keep our questions really concise, please. Mr. Constant. Okay. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, thanks. On the auction thing, offline you can give me where the stuff that gets auctioned generally comes from.
Okay.
You know, seizures and lots of other things.
Sure.
And I assume that we get quite a bit of revenue from selling stuff. And I'd like to see what that revenue from that is, and then what the cost of doing the auction.
Okay.
Total cost. Seizing stuff, storing it, running the auction. So, not
I'm sure
impressive.
Lon would love to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Trainee.
Just Pete, Black and Beach, the first implementer we had, Dan Sullivan, who was mayor, signed agreement that we will never sue them. So we can't go back against that company. The first implementer was a problem manifest for that. We can never sue them. So, just let us know.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee.
You did implement it.
As always. All right, Mr. Wilbur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So moving on. So these are some of the direct cost decreases. As I mentioned, we scrub our labor, and one of the things that we've done is when we looked at, there's a little bit more detail in your assembly documents, the labor alignment. Basically, we look to make sure that what we actually have budgeted for the cost of labor in 19 is the true cost based on the labor agreements. And so we true that up, and we, most of the changes that are reflected in this reduction of labor costs is in APDA, IBEW, plumbers. If you want to know how much is in each, I can break that down for you. But the other thing that also includes is about $200,000 of that is with the AMEA contract. That one in particular, we budgeted the contract to start in January. The ratification of the contract doesn't happen until like June or whenever they're going to done. So the amount that we budgeted in 19 is not retroactive to the first of the year, so those are costs that we will not incur. We'll start incurring those costs after the contract's approved. The next one is fire and police retirement, debt service, and contributions. It's a net of about $800,000 reduction. What happened here is for our contributions to the police and fire retirement certificate of participation, we budgeted a dollar amount in 2019. The first payment of that was actually due January 1st of 19. So we paid it out of 18. So we paid the money out of our 18. So where we are now is we are basically in alignment so that the budget is lined up with the schedule of the debt payments. We were, so anyway, that is what we've done in this one here. And then the contributions to police and fire retirement, there were some things that were up, I think primarily on the personnel side, but that's the net change there, so that was an overall reduction. I did mention that Susie's been doing a great job. She did some excellent work in 18 and in 19 through some work through SAP and negotiations for hosting our data. We're going to see a reduction of about $500,000 in our cost for hosting data off of servers and in the cloud, so we were able to do that. And then East High Pool, for many of the assembly you may know, we pay the utility bills in pools at the school district. East High is closed down for the year, so we won't be doing those expenses. And that's a net of any rental receipts we might receive from the pools, so that will be a reduction from the Parks and Rec Department. So when you look at the total costs and the net increases and reductions, the net is a total adjustment of budgets of about $2 million.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, help my memory. Police and fire are not under PERS, is that correct?
That's correct, is that right? Yeah, that's correct.
And
No, they're in the old plan.
Go ahead.
Right.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, through the chair, this is the remaining amount of the old police and fire retirement system that
okay, I got that.
currently has
so under the
100 members.
under the new one, if I may continue, the state has in years past contributed something to the boroughs and municipalities for a PERS thing. What's happening with that? And what are we planning on happening?
Through the chair, my understanding is that the system as it was last year is still this year, so we don't have any changes in allocation and contribution percentages from the state.
How much?
I don't know.
How much was
that answer for
it
you.
last year? Rough numbers?
I do not know.
It wasn't 100 million, and it wasn't 100. I think it was a couple million.
We'll get the number. It's a big number.
Okay, that's what I hoped. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Constant.
Thank you. On that police and fire line, then, the savings, this is one of the lines that we funded the certificates of participation with. And so how does this play with that?
So what it does is that we budget, in the first slide we showed that we have we budgeted an increase of $7.5 million to pay the certificate of participation in 19. The first payment was, so we budgeted more than we actually now need to spend because the first payment we paid in 18. What that in effect did is it consumed our 18 funds, but we also were then going to save the money in 19. So we took the savings from the 19 budget for that payment. And as a result, as I mentioned, it's getting our budget in line with our debt payment schedule.
So we still have the full payment due for this year.
We do.
And then, but we will have a little bit of a play in there, $835,000 because we prepaid. Is that what I'm hearing?
This trues it up. This trues it up does not leave any additional funds in 19. This is truing it up in 19.
And so, do we have a strategy when possible to prepay, or is that how that was, or what was the rationale for that for the payment?
The rationale was that the payment was due on January 1st, and in order to pay the payment on January 1st, we pulled the money out of December to pay the January 1 payment instead of paying it out of January 19.
for more clarity, in order to make a 1/1 payment, you can't send them the money on 1/1. You have to send them the money on 12/31. So what we learned is never make a debt contract where we have to pay something on 1/1. That's all it is.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. And this is a conversation I've had a little bit with Mr. Falsey, and unfortunately he's not in the room. And this is both a question and a statement, but that certificate of participation debt that we owe and the sort of plan we've structured is pretty significant. It's many millions of dollars a year. And if we could do the math on what that equates to as sort of a percentage, and then, God willing, if the MLMP sale goes through, we can pay off debts or we can invest in a trust fund. And we should obviously pay off debts that have a higher interest rate than the trust fund, right? So that should be one of the conversations I hope that we're having, is looking to prepay or pay off a chunk of this debt if we think this is more expensive to us than what we would earn from the trust fund.
Yeah, and we will look into that, because I believe it's this fund here. There's actually a penalty for over contributions to the fund.
Well, that's annoying. But
I think Ms. Browse wants to speak to me.
Through the chair to Mr. Dunbar and Mr. Slivik, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but all municipal debt is on the table for consideration with the MLNP funds. But the other thing that has to come under consideration, as Mr. Wilbur said, is any prepayment penalties or defeasance costs that are associated, so interest rates and the other penalty payments that would be required as part of the payoff will go into the consideration as to whether or not it makes more sense to do it this way or do it that way. And yes, we will bring all of those options to the assembly once we know the direction that it is going in.
thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Constant.
Just as a matter of policy, we have previously been told, and I believe that we have done a good job of paying off any high interest debts that we have, and that most of our debt is at kind of historic low rates. And so when we get to those questions, it's going to be really hard to find something that we can pay off that will perform better than what we can earn, because we've been pretty well fiscally managing our debt reports. As I understand it, it has been reported, and I look forward to seeing those facts again in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Go ahead, Mr. Wilbur.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the next few here, this is just a summary of where the 2019 budget was approved and the adjustments that will reflect in this first quarter budget. So you can see the total budget appropriation would go up about $2 million. That's that 1.98. The position count's up a little bit. I mentioned those. And then the property taxes would go up about $5.7 million. I'll point out that, one of the big things, and I didn't include it in the original slides, but one of the things that you have on your AM support is we can adjust, we are obligated to adjust the tax cap for settlements and judgments. We had a significant settlements and judgments that we need to true up for workman's comp and general liability, and so that's a significant portion of the adjustment in the base. And that also is included in your assembly documentation. So the last couple slides I want to show is this is what we set the mill rate at this time of the year. So last year, this time, when we were adjusting 2018 first quarter, the proposed mill rate, or the approved at that time, the mill rate was 8.83. This proposed budget would make the mill rate 8.88. So it would be an increase of about 0.05. The school district in 1Q, what we had was 7.23. Their approved budget, approved by the assembly, has a mill rate of 7.16 for a total mill rate of 16.4. There's a lot of factors that go into the mill rate. New construction was up a little bit overall, so that helps us with tax cap settlements. Compared to last year, the amount that we want to do this year, the overall amount of settlements is less. MUSA and MISA, while some of them were had changed, the overall MUSA and MISA would be up. Gas tax is up for this one. When we set 1Q, remember, we didn't turn the gas tax on until March, so we only had 9 months of the gas tax. This one is 12. Motor fuel tax. Sorry, Mr. Cheney. Motor fuel tax.
I know, that's what I was about to tell you.
It's the motor fuel tax. I had a bad vibe there for a minute, and I just looked right at you and thought motor fuel. So marijuana, the marijuana sales, they're up from 18, and so and assessed valuations are up. So the net of all of those is what we have here. These documents, these are two separate assembly documents that you have. I think they're 46 and 47. That will set the mill rates for those. And then the last slide I have prepared. This is a hard concept to explain, but I'm going to do my best. So the first row is what the mill rate is currently set at in the approved budget for the school district, 7.16. The school district, they're on a different budget year than we are. They're going from July through June. They're on a state calendar year. So the taxes that we collect to support the school district, we collect, if they have a $200 million budget, which they don't, we collect $100 million this year, and then we collect $100 million next year, and that's for their calendar year. So bond debt reimbursement would likely be a similar approach. So in the event that the legislature did not approve the $41 million, I think I used $41 million in this session for bond debt reimbursement, the amount we would be immediately obligated would be $20 million for the first half of that bond debt. Okay, if we wanted to do it all now at that $40 million, that's the second option. So if we added $20 million in bond debt for the school district's mill rate would go from 7.16 to 7.76. So the total increase for half of their debt would go up about $60. The number that we've been working with primarily in the conversations with you is that if we were to recover the entire $40 million and then pay that debt in the year, it's $120 per assessed value. That's where you get the $420 for the average house. If we don't if we don't make an adjustment for the school district's mill rate in 19, and the legislature doesn't pay anything, we're going to recover it all in 20. We would recover the half that we have to do for 19, and then all of 20, and then that would be a scenario. Those dollar numbers are based on the current assessed valuations and this picture point in time. Those numbers are going to change. It's going to depend on whether they do, if they say we'll reimburse 25% or 75% this year, 50% next year, and 100% or go, whatever they do, we're going to have to adjust. This proposed budget makes no adjustments into their mill rate because we do not know what they're going to do. Whatever they end up at, we are going to have to make that adjustment for 19 or for 20, 21, and in the future. So I put this together to sort of illustrate what that would be. Depending on where this legislature ends, will be however we adjust the school district's mill rate. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Mr. Wilder. Got some questions. Mr. Constant.
So it does make sense, but my question is this like choose your own adventure? Next week we determine are we going to do A, B, C, or D, or is this just notifying us that when the legislature makes their decision, we'll come back to this table and opt to either re-levy, I don't know how we would do that, or we are going to be under a scenario next year where it could be any of these three?
So I would answer that two ways. We have chosen your adventure. It's line number 1.
Okay.
But you have asked what would happen if at the end of that, what would be the occur? What would those numbers look like? So I've first prepared this for illustration. That's the only reason why. It's for information.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Weddleton.
Following up on that, so you made a choice, but we don't have to choose that. We could decide that's not.
Well, we made a choice. We
No.
approved that budget, right?
Not yet.
No.
We said the mill rate.
We wait till we get 3 new people before we do this risky kind of stuff.
The first thing we make them do is vote on property
Three of
taxes.
you, whatever you think.
We're sharing the blame. We're sharing the blame.
So if we were to say, look, the more conservative or careful one is do the 20 million, just throwing out there. then we'll tax for that.
That's right. We would set the mill rate at 7.76, and then the cost to the individual homeowner would be roughly that amount.
Okay, and what are the downsides to doing that? Besides, obviously, we're taxing people more and they're upset, but.
Well, the downside is that for a variety of things, it might be too much, it might not be not enough, and then how are we going to adjust for that the next year around? So, again, I guess that's what I
Right,
want.
so we potentially we would have collected $20 million we didn't need. Now what do we do with it?
So
I think Mr. Slivka wants to respond.
I would say that route creates many processing challenges when, if in fact the legislature does not pass it, we can very easily issue another tax anticipation note because we know we can tax for it. We get the money like that. We don't bother anybody. And then next year, when we know what we have to tax for, we can do it very easily. That's probably the smoothest operational way because, as Lance saying, if you say, okay, we'll do 20, and it turns out you don't need it, we have a big processing mess. So if we don't do it, and we are, and the legislature says we're not paying, then we could end up dumping on taxpayers $61 million, and that's a lot. People are going to really get hurt.
That's
So
right.
we do have some balance. I mean, I think you start getting into the political arena. You pass for something, then you send the legislature a message, hey, we'll pay for it. And it's like, cool, we're not going to give you this money. Or, but it's from a process standpoint, if you assume they're going to give it to you and they don't. Just from a process standpoint, it is the most efficient, least costly way to do it. But the burden is going to be whatever it is eventually. And yes, it would, unfortunately, all land. But that might also give taxpayers an incentive to get on the telephone to June.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Wells. Mr. Dunbar.
I want to ask a clarifying question. I was going to ask John's question, but now I have a clarifying question to that, which is, did you say that there was a way, so let's say we set it at 7.16 and it goes out, and then because the legislature takes a while and they drag out, and then it turns out we should have done the $20 million route, and I think that's probably the most likely. That's what the House passed yesterday. So half of it. Do we have some mechanism to then do another? Is that what you're saying? This year to do that additional $20 million?
So what we would do is we would issue tax anticipation notes to
Sure.
manage our cash flow. And so what we would know is at some point further on in the year, we were going to be $20 million short.
Mm-hmm.
So we would issue $20 million of tax anticipation notes because we know we can tax to recover it. So that's just going out to the market, borrowing $20 million.
Oh, so I misunderstood.
We're not bothering any individual at all.
Well, yes. So now I understand. So it's not you can send out another tax notice and say, oh
No,
no,
we're not.
by the way,
Right.
it's actually a little bit higher.
Right.
Which kind of seems like why can't we do that? Because we don't collect the property taxes right when we send out the notices.
It's as Lance has said, we go through this huge process to figure out what the mill rate is.
Sure.
And then we issue all the tax notices. We would have to reissue 90,000 tax notices. I mean, it's just not cost efficient, whereas we can borrow money at 1.5%, which is what we did this year's tax anticipation.
Yeah, but it gets back to what John, I think, was getting at. Then in 2020, there's this huge tax spike. And the way people's minds work too, it's more than a year removed from what actually caused it. And I know you think it'll cause people to get on the phone with their legislator, but perhaps by 2020 it'll be too late. The legislator will have already done this.
I mean, again, at the end of the day, it is your choice. I just would offer that issuing tax anticipation notice is going to be the most efficient way to do it. Trying to presuppose, pre-guess a number, and if wrong creates an enormous amount of challenges.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Constant.
Okay, I just want to ask, is it legal for us to tax at that higher level if we don't have a need currently?
Well, it's if you determine the mill rate, approve that mill rate, that's the
legal.
that's
So then ultimately it is a policy call that we have to determine this question.
Ms. Ennis.
I think we would want to do a little bit more research on how that interacts with the tax.
Right, because
I don't think it is quite that simple.
Okay.
And perhaps we should have that done by next Tuesday.
Please, thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
So, I know, Alex, you said that it caused a huge process problem, but if we went with the $20 million option and it turned out by some miracle that it was actually we didn't need that, why can't that money be rolled over and sort of put against people's tax liability in 2020? Is that just not legally
I mean,
possible?
it's what we would have to do. Our software program, which is in the process of being put in place, which is ancient, I don't believe it's currently set up that way, but we would certainly have to do that.
I've asked the school district, because this would be their budget next
Right.
year.
Right.
What would they do? And they would have to, if they came up with an 8 mil rate, and we'd already taxed them for 0.6 extra, the mill rate they should give us would be 7.4.
Ms. Press.
And correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who knows in this room. I believe if we did what Mr. Dunbar is suggesting, it would lower the tax cap also.
Thank you. Mr. Wells.
The reimbursement would lower it, but not the initial collection. Is that right?
If you over-collect in 1 year and under-collect in the following year, you have then set the tax cap for the next year at the under-collected rate.
But,
yes, Mr.
But if the legislature does this, they'll probably do it next year too. That is to say that the $40 million, I'm not sure what it is in 2020, probably $30 or $20 million, but I remember we got testimony that said it's actually $300 million they're talking about not paying us over the course of, I think, 15 years. And so would the tax cap actually fall, or would it just go up slightly less quickly? Because you'd be taking that money and applying it to a cost, but you'd still have an additional cost because of the additional fall in funds from the legislature.
Yeah. So
I don't think I track what you're saying.
Well,
Mr. Dunbar, if I may.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of questions about this specific proposal that I think warrant its own work session before we vote on it. So I think we could probably spend another good hour just on this. So can we get all of our questions to the administration, allow the administration to provide responses, and then have a work session just on this? Like Tuesday.
No, we have more time than that.
It's the 23rd. That will be the
that's right.
Yeah, that's right. Next Tuesday. Yeah.
Did you hear that, Dee?
Next Friday.
Don't work all weekend.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds, unless there's objection, it sounds like we're amenable to that. All right, Mr. Wilbur.
All right, real quick, for the utilities, basically what we did there is we scrubbed their budget, and we did some pluses and minuses for their bargaining units, for their IGCs, their contributions for intergovernmental costs. We basically trued that up. All of that detail is in your budget. There's really no big surprises there. We talked about solid waste. We are going to adjust their budget for a dividend. That is in the proposal, and then they have a couple positions as they relate to renewable energy. So those are also in there. The port dividend adjustment, that actually is a positive. In Merrifield, there's really no change in there. So the utilities, other than truing up, there's no significant changes in there. I think solid waste actually will have a little capital adjustment based on what we had approved in their budget and what you had approved for their plans for the redevelopment. We want to reflect those in their capital budget. So really nothing going on there. So this is what's going on. I met with the Budget Advisory Commission yesterday. Their interest in the school district debt reimbursement was equal, just to find out what the scenario would be and which one it would be. This work session, you guys have a Budget and Finance Committee next week. I won't be talking too much about this unless you have other questions. You guys have a scheduled work session for the 19th, which is next Friday, for your amendments to the budget. I know that I've received copies of a couple. You're scheduled for public hearing and approval on the 23rd. And then based on our code requirement, we have to have the tax bills out by May 15th. We back up from that. Treasury needs to know exactly what it is by May 5th, so they can get it to the printers and we can get it out, which gives us a deadline to make sure that Treasury has what they need by the 1st. So, again, if you guys have questions, please, that you weren't able to ask here, ask Desiree. We'll get through them. We will get responses to all of the questions that you've had today. We'll do that as soon as we can, certainly before, we'll do the best we can to get them all answered before the 19th. And that's what I got.
Thank you. Mr. Gates.
Just remind me, we had a resolution to set the mill levies at the May 7th Assembly meeting, is that right? Or is that the 23rd?
That's the 23rd.
All right, thank you. This session is over.
This might